Hello, I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation, and welcome to the global studios of the Foundation for our virtual program series. Through the Foundation programming, we are pleased to open the virtual doors of the National Archives and share more than 15 billion records, documents, objects, and most importantly, the stories from our nation's past. Thank you for joining us from home today for another spirited conversation, and today I'm delighted to host the next edition of our First Ladies series. Our guest speaker today will be taking your questions later, so I encourage you to use this opportunity to know how to ask questions. We're going to be using the YouTube chat on the side of your screen there. So to get a little practice, put your hometown and state in there, and I will give you a shout out later in the program. Well, let's jump right to it. Our featured speaker today is Katherine Jellison. Katherine is professor of history at Ohio University, where she teaches courses on U.S. women's and gender history. She's published a number of books and authored a biography on Jacqueline Kennedy in the Blackwell Companion to First Ladies. She's frequently appears in print and on television and radio as a commentator on First Ladies and their role in U.S. politics and history, and that is why she is here today. Katherine, are you with us?
I'm here, Patrick. Thank you for the nice introduction.
Excellent. How are you doing, and how's Athens?
Athens is wet right now. Raindrops are falling on my window, but at least not on my head. So I think I'm ready to go whenever you are.
Terrific. Well, I know you've got a great presentation, so I'm going to pass the screen to you and take it over.
Okay. Let's see. Here we go, I think. Ooh. Yes. As Patrick said, I am a historian here at Patrick's alma mater, Ohio University. And I was very pleased when Patrick invited me to give the presentation today that I have entitled Celebrated, Controversial, Reluctant, and Political U.S. First Ladies. This is a photograph of the First Ladies exhibit at the Smithsonian Institution, the National Museum of American History, several years ago, showcasing First Ladies of the Gilded Age and Progressive era. And various First Ladies of that period fell into these categories of the celebrity, the controversial First Lady, the reluctant First Lady, the political First Lady. And these are the four categories that scholars and the general public largely put First Ladies into. So I'll give you some quick examples of each of these four archetypes and using examples from living human memory. The celebrity First Lady, I assume this woman needs no introduction, Jackie Kennedy, arguably the most famous woman in America during her time as First Lady, perhaps the most famous woman in the world, later to be known as Jackie O. And so when we think of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, we usually think of her as a celebrity First Lady. Another recent First Lady in living human memory, at any rate, is Nancy Reagan. And she would be considered by most people a controversial First Lady. She was criticized while she was in the White House for spending too much money on her wardrobe and the White House china, giving advice too freely in terms of appointments to her husband's staff and cabinet, and also was controversial for consulting with an astrologer as she was planning her husband's daily schedule. So Nancy Reagan would be an example of a recent controversial First Lady. A reluctant First Lady would be Bess Truman. Bess Truman did not like the White House very well. She would always rather be at her home on Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri. I frequently here in the Zoom era and YouTube era have given several talks about First Ladies all around the country. And I was giving one recently on Zoom in Rochester, Minnesota. And one of the people in the audience had been a child at the time of the famous Whistle Stop campaign that Harry Truman ran during the 1948 presidential campaign. And I had been talking in the presentation about Bess Truman being a reluctant first lady. And this member of the audience said, yes, she was so reluctant that when I saw her as a child on the back of that train platform, everyone was trying to get her to speak. Her husband was trying to get her to speak. The mayor of Rochester, Minnesota was trying to get her to speak, but she remained reluctant to the end. She just waved at the crowd and never spoke. So Bess Truman would be an example of a reluctant first lady. And then there are the first ladies in living human memory who were the political partners. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt was her husband's eyes, ears, and legs necessarily, since he was disabled. But I think even had the president had full use of his legs and could travel easily in the 1930s and 1940s, that Eleanor Roosevelt still would have been a political partner and would have been out in that role throughout the country, regardless of her husband's physical status or condition. And I might as well tell you right now, she's my favorite first lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. But I talk about Eleanor Roosevelt very often, and she is a first lady that many people know a lot about. So when Patrick asked me to do this presentation, we thought about maybe talking about first ladies who aren't as well known as Eleanor Roosevelt. And I would start to complicate these four categories and begin to discuss how it's really not terribly historically accurate to place any one first lady in one category, the celebrity, the controversial, the reluctant, or the political, that most first ladies were a combination of several of these characteristics. So I want to look specifically at three first ladies who lived in very different periods in US history and talk about the reality of their years as first lady and discuss ways in which they crossed these categorical boundaries. So the first of these first ladies is an early Republic first lady that I would like to talk about a little bit, and that's Dolley Madison. Here she is in a photograph taken very late in her life. She's one of our first ladies to be photographed, although she was photographed several years after she was no longer first lady. I'll be showing you another one of these late in life photographs of Dolley Madison in a minute. Most people would categorize her as a celebrity first lady because of her great reputation as a Washington hostess. And she certainly was a celebrity in her own time and subsequently. Because of her great fame as a hostess, a number of dinner party products have been named after her over the years. And I wanted to share some images of those products to show you how renowned Dolley Madison was and how her fame continued for centuries after her first ladyship. Back in the 1920s, for instance, this advertisement here on the left is for a brand of Boston cream pie named for Dolley Madison. A few decades later, there was Dolley Madison ice cream. I think actually the woman in this ad looks more like Marie Antoinette than Dolley Madison, and actually the ad on the left looks more like Bo Peep than Dolley Madison, come to think of it. There was even a brand of wine in the 1950s that was named for Dolley Madison. And some of you may recognize the young model who modeled for the label for Dolley Madison wine. It's a young Marilyn Monroe. And then here in our own time, of course, we know about the Dolley Madison snack cakes. But Dolley Madison was more than a celebrity hostess. Here's another one of those photographs taken of her late in life with one of her nieces here on the right. Here on the left is a statue at the Madison Estate, Montpelier. It's a statue of Dolley and James Madison collaborating, consulting, And I would suggest that this statue presents an accurate presentation of Dolley Madison. She was very much a political player. And in fact, the reason for her great success as a hostess was in her role as a political partner to her husband. If we think about the situation at the time of Madison's presidency, he was only the fourth man to have held that office. And it was at a time when there was a great deal of competition between the executive and the legislative branches of the federal government. And much of Dolley Madison's success as a hostess was based on the idea that if she had great social events, she could bring together all kinds of people, merchants, legislators, political adversaries of her husband's, political supporters of her husband, and in a social setting, get people talking and discussing the great ideas of the day. And because of her great parties, dinner parties and balls at the White House, and always attracting such a diverse clientele of movers and shakers, she was able to establish the White House as the center of power in Washington, D.C., the place where everyone wanted to go because everyone wanted an invitation from Dolley Madison. And this helped elevate the executive branch, at least a bit above the legislative branch, and establish the presidency as the center of power in our nation's government. She was also very critical to the way in which the White House as a building was organized. The idea that several of the rooms were public reception rooms, and these were places where people could come in and meet the president and first lady in these social events. And the White House wasn't simply a place where the president had his office and his living quarters, but was a place for people to come and meet the president, meet the first lady, and come to have important conversations about the nation's business and about the nation's policies. So Dolley Madison was the successful hostess she was, motivated by this idea that she needed to be a political partner to her husband. We, of course, largely know about Dolley Madison's dedication to the White House and keeping it as the center of U.S. power and government in the story about her rescue of a copy, actually, it wasn't the original, a copy of Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington. And there have been many artistic representations of her rescue of that portrait. And I must say, this is my absolute favorite. It's a child's birthday cake. And although some children might request, a birthday cake in the shape of one of the Sesame Street characters or Thomas the Train, this little boy had become very enamored of this story of Dolley Madison rescuing the portrait of George Washington. So he begged his mother to have a birthday cake that looked like the burning of the White House in the War of 1812 and Dolley Madison's rescue of the portrait. So here's the cake, decorated to look like a burning White House, and Dolley Madison is a cookie running away from the White House with the portrait of George Washington. So I just love a kid getting into history and getting into the history of first ladies so much so that he wants to create a birthday party theme around this incident. But this artistic representation much more shows a realistic interpretation of that scene, a much more chaotic scene. And Dolley Madison is fleeing the White House, not alone with the portrait of Washington under her arm, but with the assistance of several other people, including enslaved laborers who worked at the White House. And in fact, that portrait of Washington was so large, she could not have taken it down herself and carried it away. It had to be unbolted from the wall and then carried to waiting cart to take it away from the White House. And in fact, most of our best accounts, and there are some conflicting accounts, but our best accounts indicate that it was a young enslaved teenager who unbolted the portrait from the wall, and he and other enslaved workers there at the White House then took it out to the waiting cart. So I don't want us, as we leave our consideration of Dolley Madison, to forget that enslaved labor guaranteed her social success as a White House hostess and political player. One of her great social successes was an incident that apparently was a hit in the early Republic period, but we would find it very questionable today. She had several enslaved men stand with lit torches over their head throughout one of her social events to be sort of a human chandelier. So she relied both in her role as a celebrity hostess and as a political player in Washington on enslaved labor. And after the burning of the White House, she was very quick to reestablish the president's temporary residence again as the seat of power in the city of Washington, D.C. And again, very quickly in the Madison's temporary living quarters, started her series of social events once again. So Dolley Madison, more than a celebrity hostess. And at her passing in 1849, the then president, Zachary Taylor, eulogized her as truly our first lady for a half century. Now I'd like to shift to a very different period, the Gilded Age, and to Lucy Hayes. Of course, I had to have an Ohio First Lady. Since I'm speaking to you from Ohio University, I had to have one of our examples of a First Lady from Ohio. Lucy Webb was born very near to where I'm sitting right now, here in southeastern Ohio. And on the left, we see her wedding photograph with her husband, Rutherford B. Hayes. And here on the right, we see her official White House portrait. She's someone else that, to the extent people think much about Lucy Hayes, they probably think of her as another celebrity hostess. She was very successful as a Washington hostess, and she is known as the first lady who began the Easter egg roll annual event at the White House. But again, she was more than a celebrity hostess. Lucy Webb Hayes had some very definite political ideas herself. She was from a very strong abolitionist family, and as a younger woman had been very involved in the campaign to abolish slavery. She was also a member of the temperance movement and was well known as a temperance advocate. In fact, the portrait you see here of her, her official White House portrait, was commissioned by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the largest temperance organization of the period. So they commissioned and paid for this portrait of Lucy Webb Hayes. She was very much celebrated by others in the temperance movement, but that then made her not very popular with the nation's liquor manufacturers. And we have to remember that the Women's Christian Temperance Union, here when Lucy Hayes was First Lady in the late 1870s and the early 1880s, it was not only the nation's largest temperance organization, it was the nation's largest women's suffrage organization. Members of the WCTU wanted women to gain the ballot because they felt if women were voters, they would vote for pro-temperance candidates, they would vote for pro-temperance legislation. So she was not someone who was popular with anti-suffragists nor with the liquor industry at the time that she was First Lady. Now, this nickname that she has become known by, Lemonade Lucy, that was hung on her after her time as First Lady to commemorate the fact that this was an alcohol-free White House. But again, to show you the kind of political partnership that she actually enjoyed with her husband, Rutherford B. Hayes, she and he came to this decision together that no alcohol would be served in the Hayes White House. Lucy Hayes is also our first college-educated First Lady and the first First Lady to be regularly referred to by the press by that title of First Lady. Now, certainly, as I have indicated, she had her own strong political ideas, and she was celebrated for those by temperance advocates, but she was also controversial among those who did not look favorably on women's suffrage or the temperance crusade. So we could say she's political, she's a celebrity, but she's also controversial in some quarters. Speaking of her reputation as a celebrated hostess, here on the left, you see one of her elaborate gowns. This is what she wore to a White House reception on New Year's Day in 1879. So she was considered quite fashionable, and her gowns were commented upon favorably by fashion critics of the era. She also, though, is our first post-Reconstruction First Lady. Coming through that period of division of the Civil War and Reconstruction, something that she attempted to do in the White House, in her 4 years in the White House, and her husband had made the vow that he would only be in the White House one term, and that is indeed what happened. During those 4 years, she is in the White House as the first post-Reconstruction First Lady. She tries to make the White House a location that celebrates national American unity. And she commissions the most unique set of White House china. And if I am confessing what my favorites are, I've told you my favorite First Lady is Eleanor Roosevelt. Well, my favorite White House china is the Hayes china because it celebrates North America, flora, fauna, and the indigenous residents of North America. So here is a piece of the Hayes china, a couple of more pieces. I just think these are so interesting. And some people found them controversial. So we're back to that characteristic because they certainly were not the standard type of Victorian china. But I love the idea that she attempted to celebrate American themes. And I think they're beautiful pieces myself. She also served very plain meat and potatoes menus at her social events. No French food in the Hayes White House, again, celebrating American unity during the years that she is First Lady. Well, now, closer to our own time, Betty Ford. And I would say that Mrs. Ford actually fulfilled all 4 categories. She was ultimately a celebrity, she was controversial, she was definitely political, but she was also reluctant. Here on the left, we see a picture of the Fords at their wedding. And here on the right, a screenshot of Betty Ford during her very famous, in some quarters infamous, TV interview on 60 Minutes in 1975. Well, I like to refer to Betty Ford as our first television era First Lady. And you might think, well, that can't be right. Wasn't there Jackie Kennedy and her famous televised tour of the White House? Yes, but I think Betty Ford was the first First Lady who really recognized the power of television to get out her own messages and in a very straightforward way. very soon after she becomes this accidental first lady, remember, she becomes first lady after Richard Nixon has, in disgrace, resigned the presidency and her husband, Gerald Ford, becomes president. She had never thought about possibly becoming first lady, and now she is. And very shortly after the Fords come to the White House in 1974, Mrs. Ford is diagnosed with breast cancer. And she had photographs such as this one from her hospital room after her mastectomy, had them shown on television and helped destigmatize breast cancer. She was very upfront about the medical condition she was suffering from and its treatment, and made sure, I remember as a child looking at pictures like this on the Today Show. She released photographs of her stay in the hospital for treatment of breast cancer to the public. But it was the following year when she appeared in 1975 on the 60 Minutes program that she really became the television era first lady. Those of you who may remember that interview, she is very much a woman of the 1970s, a middle-aged wife and mother of the 1970s who says to Morley Safer, who is the CBS correspondent who's interviewing her, "Oh, I wouldn't be surprised if my children had tried marijuana. Oh, I wouldn't be surprised if my 18-year-old daughter has, experimented sexually." And she also endorsed the Roe v. Wade decision and said that she believed abortion should be legal. Well, there were some of the culturally conservative members of her husband's Republican Party who didn't like what she had to say on 60 Minutes, and were among those who the next year, 1976, pushed Ronald Reagan in his challenge to Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination in the 1976 election. But there were others who tuned into 60 Minutes and said, this is such a breath of fresh air, and really liked what Betty Ford had to say. This is not some programmed automaton. This is a first lady who's a real woman and free to speak her mind, and is living the kind of life that many of us are living here in the 1970s. So ultimately, she became a more popular figure than her husband, and continued through the remainder of the Ford presidency to advocate for political issues that she believed in, like the Equal Rights Amendment. But she was also a reluctant first lady. She wondered always that if the stress of suddenly becoming first lady had contributed to the development of breast cancer, and it had certainly exacerbated her existing dependence on alcohol and painkillers. But after she left the White House, she became a champion of, especially for women, for dealing with substance addiction and confronting it and hopefully conquering it. And as we all know, she became the founder of a series of clinics that bear her name. And in that way, continued to be someone, after she was no longer First Lady, who had a great deal of influence, and her celebrity continued. But she was very political First Lady, a controversial First Lady in some quarters, but also, she herself said, a reluctant First Lady in a variety of ways. And the ultimate accolade for the celebrity, she even had a TV movie made about her with Jenna Rollins starring as Betty Ford, dealing with her many causes and her challenges with substance dependence. So I'd say Betty Ford is someone who fits all four categories. Now, I am constantly asked, what kind of First Lady will Jill Biden turn out to be? And I can only speculate at this point, but I've oftentimes, when I'm asked this question, thought she might be a first lady in the Betty Ford mode. Someone who has a great deal of candor, is very enthusiastic about publicly supporting causes that are near and dear to her, like assistance to military families and advocating for community colleges and their students. But whatever pathway Dr. Biden ultimately follows, I'm sure that she will continue with several of these historic themes and make her way through all four of these major categories at various times, because no one first lady ever fits one nice, neat niche. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Patrick to moderate the Q&A.
Terrific. Well, that was wonderful. We flew through our nation's history in lots of interesting ways. We got some questions rolling in. So thank you. I want to remind the audience that you can use the chat box in YouTube to ask your questions. And while you're doing that, just next to our name, you can hit the subscribe button and help us get our subscriptions and followers up. So please do that while you're watching if you enjoy our programs and want to know more about our future programs. We have a great array of folks joining us from the DMV area. Arlington, Fairfax, DC, Kensington are all in the house. We've got in Texas, Austin, Frisco, Dallas, Greensboro, North Carolina. My friends in White Bear Lake, Minnesota are with us, along with Minneapolis, Connecticut, New Jersey. We've got some folks from Riverview and Palm Beach Gardens in Florida. Asheville is here, Roanoke, Dagsboro, Delaware. We've got some international in Canada, Toronto, Vancouver, and Indonesia, and of course, many from the Bobcat Nation. So we're very pleased to
I was just going to say, no Bobcats?
No, many Bobcat references for sure.
Yeah.
Well, before we jump in to the questions and let folks have a minute to add their questions, let me ask you one that's come up when we do a series with the presidential library directors, and have started this series around first ladies about legacy. And one of the things we're, as a nation, we're looking at changing legacies, especially around our founders. As you think about first ladies, and obviously the arc of history, historians like to let some time pass before they can really evaluate. But are there first ladies that you think back on, that you've studied, that we might have had one kind of belief or sort of image of a first lady, and it's really changed over time as different things have sort of come out? Are there one or two or more?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that one of the first ladies I mentioned, talked about in some detail, Dolley Madison. I think we're at a period where her reputation or her legacy is going to be seen in a more complex way. Of course, it's very easy when you have a brand of snack cakes named after you to have a certain kind of image. And I think her image has largely, obviously, been that of the hostess. And I think much of the recent scholarship, and this is one of my favorite books of the last few years. It's entitled Ties That Bound, Founding First Ladies and Slaves by Marie Jenkins Schwartz, deals with the first three Virginia presidencies. And so Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. And in this book, as well as some of the other recent scholarship about Dolley Madison, it's becoming more revealed what a political player she was, but also that legacy of being a slave owner, and her great dependence on enslaved labor, not only during the years that she is first lady, but subsequently as well, even though her husband was willing to recognize before his death that slavery needed to be abolished and make provision for his own enslaved laborers to be freed. Dolley Madison herself remained dependent on not only enslaved labor, but the selling of enslaved labor until her dying day. So I think her reputation and her legacy is undergoing a period of some recognition of its greater complexity and its problematic aspects. So that's one First Lady that comes to mind. A couple of the more recent First Ladies who I think at the time that they were First Lady were seen as involved in these nice, pretty projects for a First Lady. Jackie Kennedy, restoring the White House with historic furniture and antiques that represented the history of that house. And then her successor, Lady Bird Johnson, had what was called, when she was First Lady, her beautification campaign, which was about preserving wildflowers and making sure that our nation's highways were not cluttered with ugly billboards. But today, I think we would recognize that both of those women are very important figures in the field of historical preservation and giving more publicity to that important field. I know you and I, Patrick, would agree that's an important field. And Jackie Kennedy really brought a lot of attention to that. And then later, when she was a former First Lady in her life in New York, continued with that cause. And then Lady Bird Johnson, I think, is one of our first high-profile environmentalists, and we need to recognize that. So I think those are two First Ladies whose legacy people have recognized the greater importance of their First Lady platforms of the 1960s.
Terrific. Well, let me jump. We've got a lot of questions flowing in, so I've been trying to keep up with them. On this point, one of the questions that came up in a previous program around First Ladies, and I'm sort of getting a flavor of it here, is about the politics. Are there examples of the First Lady and the President might having contradictory messages? And specifically, a question came in about Edith Wilson in the later years of the Wilson administration. Can you comment on that?
Well, certainly, Edith Wilson says that she never took over the role of President Wilson after he was incapacitated with a stroke. She said instead she was just trying to save her husband's life, and she thought it would kill him if he had to resign because of disability. And so she assisted him in carrying out the duties, and that she never carried out any actions or policies that he didn't agree with. A First Lady who sometimes was at loggerheads with her husband was Eleanor Roosevelt. She was certainly much farther out than her husband on the issue of Black civil rights. She was probably Black America's strongest white ally in the 1930s, and her husband didn't feel he could go that far and advocate for Black civil rights in the way that Mrs. Roosevelt did, because he wanted to keep, of course, white Southern voters as part of his Roosevelt political coalition. So Eleanor Roosevelt also pushed her husband on, tried to get him to accept more Jewish refugees before the US entered World War II. She was always there pushing her husband to go farther and faster on various issues that were near and dear to her heart, but he oftentimes resisted. So I see that in that political partnership, you very much have two very strong-willed people who sometimes didn't always see eye to eye.
Mm-hmm. Okay. A few questions have come in about the different types. Is there a most common type among First Ladies? And then sort of related to that question, do you see a new archetype coming, maybe?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. I hope we're going to see the career woman archetype that's being launched with Jill Biden. our first lady to be first lady and simultaneously continue with her professional identity as an educator. So I think maybe that'll be a new archetype that is developing before our very eyes. You know, I think it's poignant, but I think of those four main archetypes, probably the reluctant first lady is the most common. Especially, there's a long period in the 19th century where we have several first ladies who were quite reluctant and rarely made public appearances. And most of those are tragic stories, actually. Andrew Johnson's wife suffered from tuberculosis, made only 2 appearances during her husband's presidency, public appearances. Jane Pierce, one of the antebellum first ladies, had tragically seen her little boy, Benny, die right in front of her eyes in a train wreck in the interim between her husband's election and his inauguration. And so she was in mourning the entire period of the Franklin Pierce presidency. Ida McKinley had several tragedies in her life that affected her physically, including the McKinley's children had all died before they came to the White House. And she had seizures that would, you know, immobilize her. So she didn't make many public appearances. And even Bess Truman, it wasn't just that she was shy and preferred life in Independence, Missouri, but her father had committed suicide when she was only 18 years old. And she was very, very devoted to her mother, whose house was there on Delaware Street. In fact, the house that Bess and Harry Truman lived in was actually Mrs. Wallace's house, Bess Truman's mother's house. And so that was a lot of her devotion to always going back to Independence, Missouri, very protective of her mother out of this tragedy in her young years. So, you know, it's sad to say, but I really think that the category that has had the most First Lady membership is the reluctant First Lady.
Okay. So we're going to go back in time to the sort of founding period. 2 questions. I'll let you answer them in whichever order makes sense for you. A question about Abigail Adams and her interest, obviously, in women's rights in the new country. Do you have any comments on that? And then who stood as First Lady for Thomas Jefferson?
Okay. All right. So in terms of Abigail Adams, she is another one of my favorite First Ladies. And I think in those polls among professional historians that are done every few years, she usually is ranked number 2 behind Eleanor Roosevelt of greatest First Ladies. And Abigail Adams, in her famous letter of 1776, she's back in Massachusetts and writes to her husband, John Adams, in Philadelphia, remember the ladies. And she was talking, a lot of people think what she was talking about there was suffrage, women's right to vote. She was talking about an issue larger than that, actually, coverture, which is the idea that we inherited from British common law that a married woman took on her husband's civil identity upon marriage. So a married woman couldn't own her own property, was not the legal guardian of her own children, couldn't own her own business in her own name, couldn't sue or be sued. So she was hoping that in the new laws, that those declaring independence in July 1776, she was hoping that in the new laws that were being declared, there would be a rejection of that old British common law idea, and there was not. We don't have state laws being passed to overturn coverture until the decades leading up to the Civil War. 1839 is the first one, but most famously, the most far-reaching of they were called Married Women Property Acts, is the New York law of 1848. So it was a long time after Abigail Adams was no longer on the scene that coverture was overturned, and then by state. But boy, she was way ahead of her time in some ways, but also a product of her time, of the Enlightenment. And she had very active correspondence with other well-educated women of her time, place, and class. So she was a remarkable woman, a Republican mother, small r, meaning that since she couldn't be a political player, she couldn't be a voter, she couldn't be an office holder, she exercised her political influence through her role as wife and mother. And of course, we know she was the wife of one president and the mother of another. And she saw her political role as urging them to embrace Republican ideals and always be active players in the life of the Republic. So who was First Lady for Thomas Jefferson? Yes, he was a widower. Several different women would fill in to be his hostess. One was his daughter, Martha, named for her mother. She would sometimes be his hostess, but also his good friend, James Madison's wife, Dolly, was sometimes the Jefferson White House hostess. So she had already started, Dolley Madison, this reputation as the Washington hostess par excellence, even before she was First Lady, because she had sometimes played the role of effective White House hostess for Thomas Jefferson.
And I would remind our viewers, if you're in Washington, when the museum opens back up, we have a terrific exhibition on women's rights called Rightfully Hers that is up in conjunction with the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, but a permanent exhibit called Remember the Ladies in our Records of Rights gallery on the first floor of the National Archives. So 2 teasers there for folks to come visit.
Yes,
and Washington.
Luckily, I got to see the Rightfully Hers exhibit before COVID hit, and it's a wonderful exhibit.
Excellent. And we will be keeping it up, even though the anniversary is coming on. We'll, because of COVID, we'll be keeping it up for a number of months after the building reopens. So lots of time to come and see us. Well, I know we have a little bit more time, so I have a little bit of a lightning round here for you. We have a number of questions of obviously First Ladies you didn't mention, so I'll let you maybe give the Cliff Notes version of what your take is, and of course, or the modern. Some of the modern presidents, so Pat Nixon, Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, Melania Trump, if you want to just run the tables for us.
Okay, well, one reason I think that Betty Ford was ultimately a popular First Lady, as I said, she had her critics and those who considered her controversial, but she ended up being a popular First Lady because a lot of people embraced her warmth and her candor and seeming genuineness, because she was a contrast to Pat Nixon, who definitely was the dutiful political wife. But remember, some of you may remember that her detractors called her Plastic Pat, because she'd been at this game a long time, since the 1940s when she had married Richard Nixon. And she was very much a product of that time, and when the political wife's role was to stand and smile and look adoringly at her husband. And so I would, if I had to choose one category for Mrs. Nixon, it would probably be reluctant. She said, although I was such a trooper and everyone thought I was the most loyal political wife, this is the last kind of life I would have ever chosen. She did say that. But she also played her role well for her generation. And in that way, one could say she was a political partner and a political asset. Let's see, who was the next person who was asked about?
So Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton, well, definitely a political partner. But she certainly became a celebrity too. And in fact, speaking of Bobcats, she and her daughter just did a Q&A over Zoom here on the OU campus. Well, they were in New York, the rest of us were here. She's become a celebrity, a household name. But yeah, obviously, I would put her in the category of political player. Michelle Obama, what first comes to mind is celebrity. Again, it's interesting. Last year, I had my Michelle Obama calendar here in the background. Right now, I have the Scenes of Ohio calendar because I've been teaching Ohio history this semester. But, you know, if you can sell calendars, I guess you're a celebrity. Also, of course, she became well known for her fashion sense, wrote a best-selling memoir, which I assigned to my graduate students a couple of years ago, because I think her memoir, Becoming, really tells the story of the second half of the 20th century and what it is to be a woman and to be a Black woman in the second half of the 20th century and now early in the 21st century. So in that way, you know, she has a politics too. And, but I think primarily celebrity. Melania, you know, I've done several of these talks, as I was saying. Each one's a little bit different. In some of the talks I have given this winter and spring, I've ended with slides not just of Jill Biden, but also Melania Trump, and asked the audience how they think those two women will ultimately be remembered. And hands down, even with the Rotary Club of Waukesha, Wisconsin, which is a pretty conservative group, a pretty conservative audience, I think, they agreed. They thought that Melania would be considered a reluctant first lady. And that same group and others have said, if we're staying with the old categories and not yet inventing new ones, they think Jill Biden will be considered a political partner. Okay.
So I'm going to try and sneak two more in here because one's really interesting and one is for all of our National Archives nerds that are on here. So what about relationships between first ladies? And this, the questioner asked about Dolley Madison and Sarah Polk and Lucy Hayes and Nellie Taft. I don't know if there's some well-known ones you might want to reference.
Well, you know who ended up being fast friends, and especially on the campaign trail for the ERA, was Rosalind Carter and Betty Ford. They ended up being a very dynamic duo, and I have a current PhD student who's writing her dissertation on this topic about their campaign together, Rosalind Carter and Betty Ford for the ERA. Hillary Clinton and Jackie Kennedy became very good friends. Of course, John F. Kennedy was one of Bill Clinton's political idols, and Mrs. Clinton looked to Jackie Kennedy, although unfortunately Jackie Kennedy died just a couple of years into the Clinton presidency, as someone to provide guidance to her in her role as First Lady. And Jackie Kennedy also had known Betty Ford when they were, congressional wives together, and she also gave advice to Mrs. Ford. I'm trying to think of some other good relationships or friendships. I don't know of any bad, downright hostile relationships. They're apparently, I guess, some people have wondered if Melania Trump is upset that Jill Biden is getting such good, for the most part, good press in these first months as First Lady. But Mrs. Trump hasn't called me up to give me what her true opinion is, so I can't comment on that.
Well, as historians will say, time will tell.
Time will tell. Well, I'll certainly say that Mrs. Kennedy was very, very helpful to Lady Bird Johnson as well. So even though Jackie Kennedy was our third youngest First Lady, she's only in her early 30s, she became so identified with the White House and how to run the White House and how to present the White House that she was someone that several subsequent First Ladies consulted.
Sure. And our last question, because this has come up in a number of programs, especially when we talk about the presidential libraries, is First Ladies materials. So before the National Archives, and I might challenge that and say before the presidential libraries, where does one find First Lady, the actual primary source materials?
Well, my understanding is that the First Lady's Library, speaking of Ohio, in Canton, Ohio, is gaining more actual research materials. It's a relatively new institution, and I think there is definitely a push to acquire more document holdings there. Unfortunately, some of the early First Ladies, their papers have been scattered hither, thither, and yon. Some were sold, at auction to private holders. So I'm going to turn that back around on the National Archives and say, next time there is a garage sale of First Ladies documents out there, Patrick, you need to be first in line.
I'll have to talk to the Archivists of the United States about that, but it's a good mission to have. Well, Katherine, this has been terrific. I have to acknowledge, besides having Bobcat Nation and support, that you've done something that no other speaker or panelist has done in all this time of doing virtual programs over the last 14 months. You have shown us the best birthday cake that I think that we've ever had on camera. So thank you for doing that.
I love that birthday cake. Well, thank you again for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, we're happy to celebrate the First Ladies, and hopefully soon enough we might have to change this to be the First Spouse or First Gentleman series. We'll have to see.
I hope so.
We're easing our way there with a second gentleman, but soon enough, I'm sure.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you so much. And for our viewers, just a few last closing announcements. Again, if you haven't hit subscribe on YouTube, please do that for us. We'd love to have you join us as a subscriber. We appreciate all of you that join us, whether you're a member, not a member, all of our corporate supporters. And if you're not a member and you'd like to learn more about that, you can join today by visiting our website, archivesfoundation.org. And of course, Mother's Day is right around the corner, and you don't want to disappoint her. She called and said she really is expecting something, a nice gift from the National Archives store. So after we wrap this up, head over to the best museum in DC and online at nationalarchivesstore.org. And don't miss our upcoming programming. May 20th at 5 o'clock, we will continue our Presidential Library series with Don Holloway of the Gerald Ford Library and Museum. Register online and join us for that. And as I mentioned in our last program, we have a lot of really interesting programs in the works. We might have to add one in May, or if not, in June. We'll be very busy. So please keep watching. You can follow us on social media, sign up for our emails. And as always, the National Archives is our nation's memory. What is past is prologue. Until next time, on behalf of the National Archives Foundation, thank you for joining us today.